How should we understand forgiveness? In the first book of Dante's Divine Comedy, the author, full of sleep at midlife, abandons the true path and finds himself in a savage forest, walking toward the gates of hell. Entering, he meets people who are suffering terribly in dozens of different ways. And his guide, the great poet Virgil, tells him not to be tempted to pity them. Virgil describes hell as the state in which we cannot receive what we truly need because of how we value what we merely want. Our struggles over forgiveness can be a kind of hell. Today I'm going to share a story, explain what is missing from our gospel, and then offer some practical hints about becoming a forgiving person. The 20th century composer Philip Glass writes that atheism was a way of life in the Jewish family he grew up in. Two of his brothers married non-Jewish women, and half his blood cousins on his father's side were Protestants. And for this reason, it surprised him when he fell in love with a Catholic woman and the two married in Europe, his father wrote him a brief letter which said this: "You are not allowed to come into the house again." Glass was devastated. He read the letter twice and then he destroyed it. He wrote, "I wanted it to just disappear." Thus began the long silence between my father and myself. So for 9 years, as his children were born, as he began to finally find success as a musician, the two men did not meet or speak at all. And what makes this so much harder was that they'd always been so close before. Glass's father actually owned a record shop, and that was how he and his son spent hours talking, and he was the one who inspired that deep love of music that Philip Glass had. And then one day, Philip Glass's cousin Norman called and said, "It's time for Ben and Ida to meet their grandchildren." And his cousin made all the arrangements to bring them back to his parents' home. Glass's father, Ben, immediately fell in love with his grandchildren. He was also happy and relieved to see his own son again. Ben said to him, "Hey kid, let's go for a walk." And they walked in silence for the first half a block until he said, "Look, you remember that letter? The one I wrote you? Let's forget it." And that's all they ever said about the matter. That was the whole conversation. 2 weeks later, Glass got a call from his brother telling him that his father had been killed by a car as he walked across the street in downtown Baltimore. So his father never saw a single one of his public concerts, never had a chance to talk to him about what he was doing. 2 years later, he could have attended Einstein on the Beach at the Metropolitan Opera in New York City. After the accident, Glass went with his brother to his father's record store, and there he found that his father had on stock copies of his first album, Music with Changing Parts. The father and his son, they never had a chance to talk about it. So for 9 years, Philip Glass met with his Freudian and the analyst about this until he just gave up trying to understand it. And then many years later, his cousin Norman explained, "When your uncles married non-Jewish women, your mother wouldn't allow them in the house anymore, and Ben was not able to see his brothers in his own home. When you married, it was his chance to get even. It was as if Ben were saying that if he wasn't allowed to see his brothers, he was going to make it so she couldn't see her son. We are the ones who are most harmed when we cannot forgive." Jesus cares intensely about forgiveness. I tried to explain this to the yoga people yesterday. He teaches us to pray, "Forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us." The context of this story matters so much. First, Jesus teaches that unless we become like children, we will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Then Jesus talks about a shepherd who will leave 99 sheep to seek out the one who is lost. And next he gives the instructions that we heard last week, the instructions about being persistent in trying to make amends with people who we think have wronged us. He wants us to address conflict wisely and directly, to structure our lives in ways that lead to apologies, forgiveness, and reconciliation. Now, this is not about abused people having any kind of responsibility to their abusers. In fact, today's Jesus story carefully explains a situation in which the one forgiving has the power and security in the relationship. It all begins when Peter asks if we should forgive as many as 7 times. And you think about it, it's a lot. Like the story last week where I talked about the friend wrecking the surfboard. Imagine he wrecked the first surfboard and I gave him another one and another one and another one 7 times. That's a lot of forgiveness. But Jesus says, no, that's not enough. We need to forgive 77 times. And then Jesus tells this story, this peculiar story about a king who absolves a slave of all his debt. And this same slave who is forgiven then fails to forgive the one who owes him. And the fellow slaves report this to the king, who throws the first slave in prison. And you remember the end. So my heavenly Father will do to you if you do not forgive your brother or sister from the heart. So I want to point out 2 issues that are not immediately obvious from the reading. The first is just to point out that it's Peter who is the one who asks this. And he clearly seems to think of himself as being on the forgiver side of the equation. Do you know what I mean? Not the person who needed to be forgiven 77 times. And in just a few chapters of Matthew, we will see how he abandons and denies his friend Jesus. So forgiveness is not an abstract or theoretical or distant matter. We know how badly he is going to feel the need for forgiveness himself. I think many of us, I know that I am, are more sensitive to the harm we suffer than to the harm that we cause. Second, the numbers that Jesus uses in this parable are absolutely extraordinary, and they influence the meaning of the story. It's important to know them in order to understand. The king forgives a debt of 10,000 talents for the first slave. So just some quick background math. A denarius is a day's labor. There are 6,000 denarii in 1 talent. So 10,000 talents is 60 million denarii. That's 60 million days' work, which works out to 165,000 years of work. So human beings, Homo sapiens, we've only been alive for 150,000 years. So there weren't any human beings or Homo sapiens 160,000 years ago. So I thought I would put it into modern numbers. So I calculated what a day's wage might be today, and it comes to $13.2 trillion. So just to give you a sense for what that means, the market cap of Apple Company is $2.735 trillion. So the king forgave his slave to the tune of about 4.8 apples. 4.8 Apple computer companies. And the slave then who doesn't forgive the other slave, that slave is asking to be forgiven for 100 days' work. And 100 days' work is nothing to be laughed at. And according to my calculation, that would be about $22,000. So in short, the king forgives an astronomically large amount, and the slave fails to even forgive a tiny portion of what he received. This reminds us that our way of thinking needs to stretch beyond our own egotism. What we owe God vastly exceeds any amount that others owe to us. We are called not to keep close track of who owes what, but to learn to live and forgive from the heart. My friend Matthew Bolton is an old friend, and he says that what at first seems like a simple technical question, how many times must I forgive, becomes the recognition that this is really about a whole way of life. In our actions and our connections with each other, we create a kind of climate or atmosphere. It can be an atmosphere of love, peace, and mercy, or one of contempt, retribution, and vengeance. In this way, the mercy we give contributes to the atmosphere around us, which in turn helps us to receive mercy and generosity ourselves. Matt says, quote, "The world we make is the world we will inhabit." Forgiveness is not so much about what we do as it is about who we are. And this isn't true not just on an individual level, but it's true in groups of people and for us as a community. Today, our annual Fall Stewardship campaign begins. We're not asking people to give anything near the total of what we have received from God. We do ask that each of us help to contribute to the atmosphere of generosity, openness, and forgiveness that thousands of people experience at Grace Cathedral here in person or online every year. Finally, I think it's important to talk practically about forgiving. Forgiving is not about accepting someone else's bad behavior or denying that something really hurt us. It does not mean sweeping everything under the rug or just trying to forget painful events. Forgiveness does not require someone to say sorry. And in fact, we are quite capable of forgiving even people who have died. Forgiveness does mean leaving the past in the past. It means taking responsibility for our feelings in the present. The world is not the way we would like it to be. Not everyone will give us the benefit of the doubt or even like us. And we should expect there will always be something to forgive and to be forgiven for. So to succeed at this, it's important not to take things personally. Doing this allows us to have a clearer vision of what other people need. When someone wrongs us, it is a good idea to check in with reliable people so that we can really understand what happened. But at some point, we have to stop blaming other people and take responsibility for our feelings right now. So the problem with blame is that it makes our feelings depend on another person outside of ourselves. It also makes us forget that that person too is one of God's beloved. Those old stories about how often others have wronged us, they can become permanent and they can make us powerless. I have a friend who I've known ever since I've lived in San Francisco. He lives on the street, and he and I stop and talk about once a week. And every time we talk, he tries to tell me about how his ex-wife ruined his life. That's like 8 years of that story. And every time I go into the conversation, I try to tell him the story about how I admire him as a person of immense inner resources, strength, and courage. He's a survivor. We all have to think about the stories that we tell ourselves, the stories that guide our lives. So what does forgiveness look like? It takes many different forms. Many years after his father's death, Philip Glass composed a violin concerto for him. Glass writes, "I knew that he loved the Mendelssohn violin concerto, so I wrote it in a way that he would have liked. In his actual lifetime, I didn't have the knowledge, skill, or inclination to compose such a work, but when I could, I wrote it for him." Do you find yourself in a hell where you are getting what you want, but not what you need? Is there a long silence between you and someone in your life? I pray that all of us will be able to replace the fable that the world tells us, the one that stokes our ego's fear of diminishment. Instead, let us embrace the extravagant story that Jesus tells in so many different ways. that we are trillionaires of the Spirit, that we are children of God. Let us contribute to the new atmosphere of mercy and reconciliation wherever we go. Together, let us learn to forgive from the heart.